Hey kids, I hope everyone is having a warm and safe weekend. Today we're going to be talking about the Phillips curve. So get those notes out, maybe brand new page, and we're going to be titling the Phillips curve. So I'm going to go to a different screen. I'll move myself over here. So this is what the Phillips curve illustrates. It shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. The relationship in the short run and in the long run. So there's going to be a short run line and a long run line on this graph, and the lines are going to, or the axes are going to be labeled inflation and unemployment. We're going to talk about how this relates to the aggregate supply and demand graph, how you would see a recession on the Phillips curve, how you would see demand pull inflation on the Phillips curve, and how you would see stagflation also on the Phillips curve. So in your notes, I'm actually going to make myself a little bit smaller here, so I'm not taking up the entire screen there. So that's a little bit better. Um, on your notes, I want you to, okay, I'm going to get rid of this or minimize it or something like that. Hopefully you can still see that somewhere, maybe. Okay, so what I want you guys in your notes is to draw an aggregate supply and demand graph, like you see over here, down there, but also a Phillips curve graph. And this is what a Phillips curve graph looks like. So inflation is on the y-axis and unemployment is on the x-axis. Here's long run Phillips curve. It is completely vertical. And short run Phillips curve is downward sloping, but it actually has like a little bit of a curve to it, like this. So a couple of things about the Phillips curve. Remember, downward sloping lines means that there's a negative relationship. So like that means inflation and unemployment are negatively related. So like if inflation is going up, that means typically unemployment's going down. And then when inflation goes down, like prices are falling, typically unemployment is going to go up. In the long run, remember, long run in equilibrium means we're fully employed. So in the long run, the unemployment is going to be at this full employment level, which doesn't really change. So we're going to be moving and doing things a lot with the short run Phillips curve, but the long run Phillips curve is the only line in this class that does not shift at all, like ever, because that represents full employment. This is full employment. And so inflation, there's no like, inflation can be all over the place. But in the long run, there is no relationship between inflation and unemployment because in the long run, we're fully employed no matter what the inflation rate is. And so that's full employment right there. Okay. So let's talk about, you see how there is boops that go all the way across here. So when you have two graphs that have similar y-axes, like price level and inflation, which is, similar, they're both prices, you can actually connect these graphs like this. So we're going to just connect them today for like learning them, but from now on, you don't have to connect them like this. I do think it helps explain how they are related though. So let's talk about how aggregate demand and supply are affecting the Phillips curve. Okay, so for example, when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, let me see if I can move this. There we go. When the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, and we have now higher prices and a higher GDP, our equilibriums are increasing. So I'll actually like arrow here, arrow there, a rightward shift of aggregate demand. Well, let's think about what that means. So when aggregate demand shifts to the right, like let me see if I can start drawing. Okay, so when aggregate demand increases, it shifts right on the aggregate supply and demand graph. And when aggregate demand shifts right, price level goes up and GDP goes up. So price level increases and GDP also increases. So we just see that. There we go. We see that on the graph right here. Prices are going up and GDP is going up. Okay, so if prices are going up, that means inflation is going up because that's the same thing. And when GDP is growing and getting bigger, that typically means the economy is getting better. And when the economy gets better, unemployment actually falls. So to illustrate that prices are going up and unemployment is going down, we can actually drag this these boops all the way across to our Phillips curve right there. And there, my friend, oh my gosh, I'm trying to make a dot there. There we have our original equilibrium and our new equilibrium. And I can actually throw some uh, boops down here like that. Okay, so this is what happens when aggregate demand shifts. When aggregate demand shifts to the right, prices go up, and we see that right here. Inflation is higher, and since GDP is increasing, our unemployment numbers actually fall. And so we move from point A, let's say, to point B on the short run Phillips curve. So we went from this point of this inflation and this unemployment, but when aggregate demand shifts to the right, it's actually a movement up the Phillips curve, and so with higher inflation and lower prices. So remember this this rightward shift of aggregate demand is actually going to create a demand pull inflationary gap, and so point B on the short run Phillips curve, like right there that you see on the screen right here, point B on the SRPC, short run Phillips curve, is demand pull inflation. Point B, going from A to B, is how you illustrate demand pull inflation. So a rightward shift of aggregate demand creates a upwards movement on the short run Phillips curve. Well, let's see what it looks like if aggregate demand was to decrease. So I'm going to get rid of a lot of the stuff that had just changed. So let me see if I can do this. I can reset the page. Okay, that's a little bit better. Okay. Oh, let me bring this equilibrium back here. I didn't need to go that far with my boobs. Okay, so let's come up with an example for aggregate demand decreasing. So let's say that, I don't know, aggregate demand AD decreases. Maybe there's less spending, or maybe taxes increased, or I don't know, net exports fell or something. So aggregate demand decreasing and shifts left on the short, on like ASAD. So aggregate demand decreases and shifts to the left. So here we have a leftward shift of aggregate demand. We have new boops this time. Boop, 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 boop. Boop, 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 boop. Okay, so with less spending, it looks like prices are going down, GDP is going down, the economy's not too good. In fact, this is actually called a recession. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, that's called a recession. So remember, when aggregate demand shifts left, that is a recessionary gap. Okay, well, let's see what that looks like on the Phillips curve. So in a period of recession, we have high unemployment. And prices typically fall because, no one's going to raise prices when no one's buying things. And we see that no one's buying things because aggregate demand is shifting to the left. See, there's an aggregate demand shift to the left. Prices are falling, GDP is falling. So if we bring this dot, this boop, 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 all the way across, it's actually going to hit our short run Phillips curve right down there. And so here is our original equilibrium at full employment at point A. But when aggregate demand decreases and shifts to the left, it's going to create a downwards movement on our short run Phillips curve to point, let's call this point C. So point C is actually how you would show a recession. So look, prices are falling, inflation is falling, and unemployment is really high. And so a leftward shift of aggregate demand actually will create a downwards movement on the short run Phillips curve. So point C is what it looks like to have a recession. So a recession, while a leftward shift on aggregate supply and demand is a downwards movement to point C. Point C on the Phillips curve, on the short run Phillips curve, is a recession. So point C, let me zoom out a little bit. Nope, that is way too far. That's still. Okay, that's a little bit better. So so shifting inwards on aggregate demand creates a downwards movement from A to C. So when aggregate demand shifted to the right, it was a movement up. When aggregate demand shifted to the left, it's a movement down. So in general, just a quick recap. Let me get rid of all of this. Nope, nope, nope. Delete. Nope, that's not going to work. Oh my gosh, seriously? And delete. Backspace? No, that didn't work either. Can I not delete you? Okay, let me just erase and I'll retype. So, in summary, when aggregate demand shifts, it creates movements on the short run Phillips curve. So when aggregate demand shifts, it creates a movement on the short run Phillips curve. So when aggregate demand increases, it's going to be a movement up the short run Phillips curve. And when aggregate demand decreases, it's going to be a movement down on the short run Phillips curve. And so you already know what shifts aggregate demand. So really, you know what creates a movement on the Phillips curve. It's just shifting aggregate demand. So all those times that we shifted aggregate demand left and right, in some alternate universe, there was a whole class just doing movements up and down the short run Phillips curve. So more spending, movement up; less spending, movement down. Okay, so that's how aggregate demand affects the Phillips curve. Let me reset the page. Reset it. Get rid of this. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk about how short run aggregate supply affects the Phillips curve. So remember, short run aggregate supply shifters are like number of sellers, input prices, technology, expectations, productivity, and that's going to shift aggregate supply. So let's just say that aggregate supply, let's say, increases and shifts to the right. So here we have a rightward shift of aggregate supply, and here's our new equilibrium. Boop, 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 boop. So when aggregate supply increases, prices go down and GDP will actually go up. So like the economy is getting better. Look at that. Prices are low, GDP is high. That is short run aggregate supply increasing. Okay, so how would I show low prices and like a better economy on this graph? So remember, prices are falling. So maybe prices are going somewhere like, I don't know, here, like it was here, inflation, maybe somewhere here. And if GDP is growing, that means the economy is getting better. That's good, which means unemployment numbers are falling. So maybe here, they were here. Now, so like this point right here, well, how could you have a point right there? Because let's bring our boops over. Boop, 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 boop. And then boop, 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 boop. Oh, that's not really even, but let me fix that. Prices are falling and unemployment is falling. How could you have a point there? Well, that's because you actually have a shift in the Phillips curve. And so when aggregate supply shifts to the right, prices are falling, which is inflation, and unemployment is falling. So you will have a leftward shift of the Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is actually going to shift to the left with lower prices and lower unemployment. Okay, so let me recap that. So when, say, short run aggregate supply increases, it shifts right on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. We did that this week. So when aggregate supply increases, for whatever reason, prices fall, GDP is growing. But on a Phillips curve, this causes a leftward shift on the short run, or of the short run Phillips curve. So it looks like when aggregate supply goes to the right, the Phillips curve actually goes to the left. And so this is the only time that a leftward shift is a good thing, because a leftward shift is saying less inflation and less unemployment, which is great. Lower prices and everyone has a job. That's fantastic. And so when aggregate supply shifts to the right, that's more supply, more production. It's actually going to bring these two things, which are bad. Inflation is not good, unemployment's not good. But now we have a leftward shift, which means we have less of both of these bad things. There's less inflation and less unemployment. That's great. This is the best type of shift. So here, I'm going to actually, let's see here. Let's do creative pen. I am going to do a big heart around this combo because this is the best type of shift. When aggregate supply increases and that causes the Phillips curve to shift left, that's great. Prices are low, unemployment's low, GDP is high, everything is fantastic. All right, let's talk about it when it goes the other way. So I'm going to reset my page. I'm going to get rid of this because I don't need that. I'm going to rechange this. All right. Now what if aggregate supply decreases? So when aggregate supply decreases, shift to the left. Here's that left shift right there. Now we have higher prices. Prices are going up. And we have lower GDP. Uh-oh, that's not good. Higher prices, high inflation, and bad economy. That's not good at all. So, like I said, when short run aggregate supply decreases, it shifts left on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. If anyone remembers, this is called stagflation, also called cost push inflation. So this is what it looks like to have cost push inflation on the aggregate supply and demand graph. You have high prices and a low GDP. So things are expensive and you lose your job. Leftward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve. But what does that do to our Phillips curve? So let me bring that equilibrium over. High prices, but also like high unemployment. Like you're at a point, let's say like here, things are more expensive. So, like, prices are going up and there's more unemployed because GDP is falling. And so, this is not good. So, how does that happen? Well, it's because a leftward shift of aggregate supply actually creates a rightwards shift of the short run Phillips curve. While right typically means like, oh, more, great. Yeah, more inflation, more unemployment. That's bad. And so a rightward shift of the Phillips curve is not a good shift at all because you have higher prices and higher unemployment. And so this is what it looks like to have cost push inflation. There's the inflation right here. And this is inflation and it's raising and higher unemployment. And so while you have a leftward shift of aggregate supply, this causes the short run Phillips curve to shift right. So look at it like this. Let's see if I can change my. Let's highlight. I guess sure. Highlight red. When aggregate supply shifts left, short run Phillips curve shifts right. So they shift in opposite directions. So when aggregate supply decreases because of cost push inflation, which is called stagflation, it's going to cause a rightward shift of the Phillips curve. So to summarize completely, let me see if I can. I need a place to write, but I'll do this. I'll do this. Extend. Okay. So when aggregate supply short run aggregate supply shifts, it causes short run Phillips curve to shift in the opposite direction. So if aggregate supply goes to the right, Phillips curve goes left. When aggregate supply goes left, Phillips curve goes right. And when aggregate demand shifts, it causes a movement up and down the short run Phillips curve. So aggregate demand shifts cause movements on the Phillips curve, while aggregate supply shifts cause shifts, but in the opposite direction on the Phillips curve. And long run Phillips curve, better not touch it. Doesn't change. So this line right here, you better leave that alone. So what we just covered was here is our Phillips curve. This point right here is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is point A. Well, I guess I should have made it point B because it was clear. Okay, here's point A, equilibrium. Let's do black. Point A is equilibrium. Point B is demand pull inflation. So inflationary gap, B right there. Point C down here, that's a recession. BAC. B, inflation. A, full employment. C, that's a recession. When aggregate supply decreases and goes to the left, Phillips curve goes to the right, and that's called stagflation. So a rightward shift of the Phillips curve is called stagflation. When the Phillips curve goes left, there's actually no name for that. So uh, movement up the Phillips curve, inflationary gap. Movement down the Phillips curve, recession. Shift to the right Phillips curve, stagflation. Shift to the left Phillips curve doesn't actually have a name. It's a shift without a name, which is very, very sad. But we're going to have a quiz about this on Monday. It's just a review. Obviously, you can use your notes, but I hope everyone's doing well. And that was your Phillips curve introduction. Bye, guys.